David pulled his pickup truck into the driveway of his new home and turned off the engine. The silence felt wonderful after months of city noise and stress. At 62, he was finally ready to slow down and enjoy life. The small ranch house in Pine Valley was exactly what he'd been looking for. Quiet street, friendly neighbors, and a backyard perfect for the vegetable garden he'd always dreamed of planting. The moving truck had left hours ago, and boxes still lined the walls of every room. But David wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in decades, he had nowhere urgent to be. He stepped onto his front porch and looked down the tree-lined street. Kids rode bicycles on the sidewalk while their parents chatted over fence lines. This was the peaceful retirement he'd earned after 30 years of high-stress work. The next morning, David woke up early out of habit. Old routines die hard, even in retirement. He made coffee and walked outside to get his newspaper. That's when he noticed the white envelope tucked under his front doormat. His name was written on it in careful block letters. Inside was an official-looking document with a fancy letterhead that read, Pine Valley Community Standards Board. The letter was polite but firm. It informed him that his mailbox was not in compliance with community standards. According to the notice, all mailboxes in the neighborhood needed to be painted forest green with gold numbers. His current black mailbox was unacceptable and needed to be changed within 7 days to avoid a fine. David scratched his head and looked at his mailbox. It was a standard black metal box, just like dozens of others he could see from his front yard. He walked down the street and counted at least 15 different mailbox colors: blue, red, white, brown, and yes, a few green ones. If there was a mailbox rule, half the neighborhood was breaking it. The letter was signed by someone named Linda Walsh, who claimed to be the president of the Homeowners Association. David had never heard of any HOA when he bought the house. His real estate agent had specifically told him there were no association fees or restrictions. That was one of the reasons he'd chosen this neighborhood. Still, David figured there might have been some confusion during the sale. Maybe the papers got mixed up somewhere. He decided to paint the mailbox green just to keep the peace. After all, he was the new guy, and he didn't want to start any trouble with the neighbors. 2 days later, another envelope appeared under his door. This time, the complaint was about his truck. According to the new notice, commercial vehicles were not allowed to be parked in driveways overnight. His pickup truck, which had a small toolbox in the back, apparently qualified as a commercial vehicle. He had 3 days to move it or face a $50 fine. David stared at the letter in disbelief. His truck was just a regular pickup, nothing fancy, nothing commercial about it. He used it to haul groceries and the occasional piece of furniture. Looking down the street again, he counted at least 6 other pickup trucks parked in driveways. Some were much larger than his and actually had company names painted on the sides. This time, David decided to do some investigating. He knocked on his neighbor's door, an elderly woman named Betty who had lived on the street for 20 years. She invited him in for coffee and listened to his story with growing concern. "I've never heard of any homeowners association," Betty said, shaking her head. "I've been here since this neighborhood was built and there's never been anything like that. We just live our lives and try to be good neighbors to each other." Betty told him that recently, a few people had been going around the neighborhood claiming to represent some kind of community board. They'd been leaving similar notices for other residents, always demanding money or changes to people's homes. Most folks had been ignoring them, but some of the newer residents had actually paid fines to avoid trouble. "You should talk to Tom down the street," Betty suggested. "He got one of those letters last month about his garden gnomes being inappropriate lawn decorations." "Can you believe that?" He told them where they could stick their notice, if you know what I mean. David walked down to Tom's house and found him working in his front yard, garden gnomes clearly visible among his flower beds. Tom was a retired teacher in his 70s with a no-nonsense attitude and a sharp sense of humor. "Oh, you met our self-appointed neighborhood police?" Tom laughed when David explained his situation. "Let me guess, Linda Walsh and her sidekick Rick Patterson. They've been going around here for about 6 months now, pretending to be some kind of authority. Most of us just throw their letters in the trash where they belong." Tom explained that Linda and Rick had moved to the neighborhood about a year ago and almost immediately started complaining about everything. When no one paid attention to their complaints, they invented this fake homeowners association and started writing official-looking letters. "The thing is," Tom said, "they've actually scared some people into paying." Mrs. Chen down the block paid them $100 because they said her rose bushes were too tall. And that young couple with the baby, they repainted their whole front door because Linda told them the color was against association rules. David felt his blood pressure rising. As someone who'd spent his career dealing with people who took advantage of others, this kind of behavior made him angry. But he kept his feelings to himself and thanked Tom for the information. That evening, David sat on his back porch and thought about his options. He could ignore the letters like Tom suggested, but that didn't sit right with him. Other people in the neighborhood were being intimidated and losing money to these scammers. The elderly woman who paid $100 for her roses probably couldn't afford it. The young couple with a baby had enough stress without worrying about fake fines. As David watched the sun set behind his neighbor's fence, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let these bullies continue terrorizing his new community. His peaceful retirement would have to wait a little longer. Some habits from his old job were hard to break, and protecting people from predators was one of them. The next morning brought another envelope under his door. This time Linda Walsh was complaining about his newspaper delivery. Apparently, having newspapers sit on his driveway for more than 1 hour in the morning created unsightly clutter and reflected poorly on the neighborhood's appearance. The fine for this violation would be $25. David smiled as he read the letter. These people had no idea who they were messing with. They thought he was just another easy target, a quiet retiree who would pay up rather than cause trouble. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. The doorbell rang at 7 in the morning, jolting David awake. He wasn't used to visitors this early, especially since he'd only been in the neighborhood for 2 weeks. He threw on a robe and opened the door to find 2 people standing on his porch. A woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair, and a man about the same age wearing a polo shirt and khakis. "Good morning," the woman said with a fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Linda Walsh, president of the Pine Valley Community Standards Board. This is Rick Patterson, our enforcement coordinator. We need to discuss your multiple violations." David looked at them calmly. So these were the people behind the letters. Linda had the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from bullying people who don't fight back. Rick stood slightly behind her, trying to look important but mostly just seeming uncomfortable. "What can I do for you?" David asked, not inviting them in. Linda pulled out a clipboard thick with papers. "You've ignored 3 official notices about violations to community standards. Your mailbox is still the wrong color. You continue to park a commercial vehicle in your driveway, and yesterday we observed newspaper clutter on your property for over 2 hours." "I see," David said. "And what exactly is the Pine Valley Community Standards Board?" "We're the elected representatives of this neighborhood's homeowners association." Rick spoke up, finally finding his voice. "All residents are required to follow our guidelines to maintain property values and community appearance." David had dealt with enough liars in his career to recognize the signs. Rick's eyes darted away when he spoke. Linda's smile got even more forced. Neither of them could maintain steady eye contact. "I'd like to see the HOA documents," David said. "The paperwork that establishes this association and gives you authority over my property." Linda's smile flickered for just a moment. "You should have received all that paperwork when you purchased your home. If your real estate agent failed to provide it, that's not our problem. But ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse violations. The fines you've accumulated so far total $125. Rick added, consulting his own clipboard. "Payment is due within 5 business days or we'll be forced to take legal action." David almost laughed. Legal action? These two had no idea what real legal action looked like. But he kept his expression neutral and asked, "What form of legal action?" "Lines on your property, court proceedings, forced compliance," Linda rattled off, clearly having practiced this speech. "The association has full authority to enforce community standards through the courts if necessary. I'll need to review those HOA documents before I pay anything," David said firmly. "Can you provide me with copies?" Linda and Rick exchanged a quick glance. "You'll need to contact the management company," Linda said. "We don't carry those documents with us." "What's the name of the management company?" Another pause. "Coastal Property Services," Rick said. "They handle all the paperwork and legal matters." David nodded and asked for their contact information. Linda scribbled a phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to him. "Remember, payment is due in 5 days," she said, her fake smile completely gone now. We expect full compliance with community standards." After they left, David immediately called the number Linda had given him. The phone rang twice before a recorded message said the number was no longer in service. He tried calling information to find Coastal Property Services but came up empty. No such company existed in the area. Over the next few days, David watched Linda and Rick make their rounds through the neighborhood. They seemed to target specific houses, usually the ones with elderly residents or young families. They'd spend 10 or 15 minutes at each door, always carrying their clipboards and official-looking papers. David decided to do some reconnaissance. That afternoon, he took a long walk around the neighborhood, stopping to chat with anyone who was outside. He met several people who'd received similar letters and visits from Linda and Rick. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly widow on the next street over, had paid $75 because Linda told her that hanging laundry on a backyard clothesline violated association rules. The young father of twin toddlers had forked over $50 when Rick claimed his children's outdoor toys needed to be stored in a garage overnight. "I didn't want any trouble," the young man explained. "We just moved here from an apartment, and I figured that's how things worked in neighborhoods like this. My wife and I are both working extra shifts just to make the mortgage payments. We couldn't afford a legal battle with the homeowners association." David's anger grew with each story. These people were specifically targeting vulnerable residents who couldn't afford to fight back. It was a classic predatory scheme, and it was working because most people assumed that official-looking letters and confident claims of authority must be legitimate. The harassment escalated when David continued to ignore their demands. Linda and Rick started showing up at his door twice a week, always with new violations and increasing fines. According to their growing list of complaints, David's garden hose was improperly stored, his welcome mat was the wrong size, and the way he parked his truck was somehow blocking sightlines for traffic. "Your total fines now exceed $300, Rick announced during one visit. "This is your final notice before we begin legal proceedings." "You know what?" David said. "I'd like to attend the next HOA board meeting." "When and where do you meet?" Linda's eyes widened slightly. "Board meetings are by invitation only for residents who are current on their dues and fines. So I can't attend a meeting until I pay fines that I'm disputing." "That's correct," Rick said, though he looked less confident than his words suggested. "And how do I contact other board members if I have concerns about your decisions?" "All communication goes through the president," Linda said quickly. "That's me. Any complaints or questions should be directed to me personally." David nodded thoughtfully. In a real HOA, there would be multiple board members, regular meetings, financial transparency, and appeal processes. Linda and Rick were making up rules as they went along, and they clearly hadn't thought through how a legitimate association would actually operate. After they left, David called Betty, the elderly woman who'd been his first source of information about the fake association. She confirmed that no one in the neighborhood had ever elected Linda and Rick to anything. Most longtime residents had never even heard of them until they started their letter-writing campaign. "The thing that really gets me," Betty said, "is how they're scaring people into paying. Mrs. Chen is on a fixed income, and she was so worried about getting in legal trouble that she borrowed money from her daughter to pay that ridiculous fine about her roses." That evening, David sat down and made a list of everything he'd learned. Linda Walsh and Rick Patterson had been running their scam for at least 6 months. They were collecting money from residents based on fake violations of non-existent rules. They had no legal authority, no legitimate documentation, and no actual association backing them up. Most importantly, they were counting on people being too intimidated, too busy, or too trusting to investigate their claims. They'd chosen their neighborhood carefully, lots of elderly, residents and young families who wouldn't want to risk legal trouble, even if they suspected something was wrong. David had seen similar scams during his working years, though usually they targeted businesses or individuals rather than entire neighborhoods. The psychology was always the same: create fear of legal consequences, demand immediate payment, and disappear before anyone could verify the claims. But Linda and Rick had made one crucial mistake. They decided to target someone who knew exactly how these schemes worked and had the time, resources, and motivation to stop them. David poured himself a cup of coffee and started planning his next move. His peaceful retirement was definitely going to have to wait. David spent the next morning at the county courthouse. a place he knew well from his previous career. The records office was exactly where he remembered it, staffed by the same helpful clerk who'd assisted him with research projects over the years. "Well, look who's back," said Gloria, the head clerk. "I thought you were supposed to be fishing and playing golf by now." "Retirement's been a little more interesting than I expected," David replied with a smile. "I need to research some property records for Pine Valley neighborhood. Specifically, I'm looking for any homeowners association documents, covenants, or deed restrictions." Gloria pulled up the computer records and spent 20 minutes searching through various databases. Finally, she shook her head. "There's nothing here, David. Pine Valley was developed in 1987 as a standard residential subdivision. No HOA was ever established, no deed restrictions were filed, and no association documents exist in our records. What about more recent filings? Maybe something from the last year or two? I checked everything through last week. If someone had tried to establish an association recently, we'd have a record of it. The paperwork has to be filed with the county and recorded in public records. There's simply nothing there." David thanked Gloria and asked for printed copies of the property records. Having official documentation would be crucial for what he planned to do next. As he walked back to his truck, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Linda and Rick weren't just lying about their authority. They were committing fraud. His next stop was the local police station. David had worked with the department on several cases over the years, and he knew exactly who to talk to. Detective Johnson was handling white-collar crime these days, and she'd always been thorough and professional. "I thought you'd retired," Detective Johnson said when David walked into her office. "I did, but retirement found me instead of the other way around." David explained the situation and showed her the fake HOA letters and county records. "I've identified at least 6 residents who've paid money to these people based on fraudulent claims of authority. The amounts range from $50 to $125 per person." Detective Johnson studied the documents carefully. "This definitely looks like fraud to me. Do you have contact information for the victims?" "I do, and I think there are probably more who haven't come forward yet. Linda Walsh and Rick Patterson have been systematic about this. They're targeting specific types of residents and using intimidation tactics to prevent people from questioning their authority. What do you need from me?" "I'd like to set up a controlled situation where we can document their fraudulent claims and attempts to collect money. I'm thinking a neighborhood meeting where they'll be forced to either produce legitimate documentation or reveal that they're running a scam." Detective Johnson nodded. "That could work, but I want to make sure we have enough evidence for solid charges. Can you get more of the victims to come forward and make official statements?" Over the next week, David quietly visited every house in the neighborhood. He introduced himself as a concerned resident who was investigating the legitimacy of the so-called homeowners association. The response was overwhelming. Nearly half the households had received letters from Linda and Rick. 15 families had actually paid money, ranging from $25 to $150. The stories were remarkably similar: aggressive visits, threats of legal action, and demands for immediate payment. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old woman living alone, had paid $75 because Linda told her that feeding birds in her backyard violated association rules about attracting wildlife. The money came from her grocery budget, and she'd been eating soup and crackers for 2 weeks to make up the difference. A young couple with a newborn baby had paid $100 when Rick claimed their stroller on the front porch was an unsightly storage violation. They were both working minimum wage jobs and had to borrow the money from the wife's parents. David carefully documented each case, taking photos of the fraudulent letters and getting written statements from the victims. The pattern was clear. Linda and Rick were specifically targeting people who were least likely to fight back or verify their claims. His investigation also revealed how the scam worked logistically. Linda and Rick would scout the neighborhood during the day, noting things like mailbox colors, lawn decorations, or parked vehicles. They'd then create official-looking violation notices that night and deliver them the next day. Their victims usually paid within a week or two, after which Linda and Rick would find new violations to keep the money flowing. The most disturbing discovery was that they'd been expanding their operation. Betty mentioned seeing them in the adjacent Oakwood neighborhood, and a quick phone call confirmed that residents there had also received similar letters from something called the Oakwood Community, Standards Board. David realized this wasn't just a neighborhood scam, it was a business model that Linda and Rick were replicating across multiple communities. They'd probably made several $1,000s over the past 6 months, all from intimidating honest people who were just trying to follow the rules. With solid evidence in hand, David arranged a meeting with Detective Johnson and Assistant District Attorney Patricia Williams. The prosecutor was very interested in the case, especially when David explained the scope of the operation and the vulnerable population being targeted. "We see a lot of scams targeting elderly residents," Williams said, "but this neighborhood-wide approach is unusual. The fact that they're impersonating a legitimate authority makes it particularly serious." "What kind of charges are we looking at?" David asked. "Fraud, theft by deception, probably conspiracy charges since there are 2 of them working together. If they've been doing this in multiple neighborhoods, we might be able to add organized crime charges." Detective Johnson suggested setting up a sting operation. "If we can get them to demand money from an undercover officer while being recorded, we'll have everything we need for an arrest." But David had a better idea. "What if we arrange a neighborhood meeting? Tell them that residents have questions about the association and want to meet with the board. They'll either have to admit they're fake, or they'll double down and make fraudulent claims in front of multiple witnesses." "That's risky," Williams said. "What if they just don't show up?" "They'll show up," David said confidently. "These 2 are convinced they're smarter than everyone else. They've been getting away with this for months and they think they're untouchable. An invitation to address the entire neighborhood will appeal to their egos." Over the next few days, David worked with several neighbors to organize the meeting. They sent out flyers to every house, announcing a Community Standards Board information session, where residents could ask questions about association rules and procedures. Betty offered her large backyard for the meeting, and Tom volunteered to provide folding chairs. Word spread quickly, and it became clear that much of the neighborhood planned to attend. People were curious about this mysterious association that some had never heard of, while others wanted answers about the money they'd paid. David made sure that Detective Johnson and Ada Williams would be present, though they'd arrive separately and blend in with the crowd. He also arranged for a neighbor to discreetly record the meeting with a video camera. 3 days before the scheduled meeting, David received another visit from Linda and Rick. This time, they seemed more agitated than usual. "We understand you're organizing some kind of neighborhood meeting," Linda said, her fake smile completely gone. "That's right. People have questions about the homeowners association, and we thought it would be helpful for everyone to meet the board members." "Board meetings are private affairs," Rick said nervously. "We don't hold public sessions." "But this isn't a board meeting," David replied. "It's a community information session. I'm sure you'd want the opportunity to explain association rules and procedures to residents who have questions." Linda and Rick exchanged worried glances. They clearly hadn't expected this level of organization or community interest. "We'll consider attending," Linda said finally, "but we want to review the agenda first." "No formal agenda," David said cheerfully. "Just questions and answers. I'm sure it will be very educational for everyone involved." After they left, David called Detective Johnson. "They're nervous, but they'll be there. They can't resist the chance to perform in front of a bigger audience." "Are you sure about this plan?" Johnson asked. "These people could just disappear if they get spooked." "They won't disappear," David said. "They've invested too much time and effort in this neighborhood, and they've gotten too comfortable with their success. Besides, running away would just confirm their guilt to everyone who's been paying them." As David hung up the phone, he felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came before closing a big case. Linda Walsh and Rick Patterson had no idea what they were walking into, but they were about to learn that their carefully constructed scam was about to come crashing down. The evening of the neighborhood meeting arrived with perfect weather. Betty's backyard filled up quickly as residents arrived carrying lawn chairs and notebooks full of questions. David counted 43 people, far more than he'd expected. Word had spread beyond Pine Valley, and several residents from Oakwood had driven over after hearing about their own mysterious Community Standards Board. David mingled with the crowd, listening to conversations and noting the mood. People were curious but also frustrated. Many had stories about confusing letters and unexpected visits from Linda and Rick. Others had heard rumors about fines and violations, but hadn't experienced them personally. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, clutching a folder full of papers. She'd brought copies of every letter she'd received, along with the receipt for the $100 she'd paid for her rosebush violation. Her daughter had driven down from the city specifically for this meeting, determined to get answers about why her elderly mother was being harassed. The young couple with the baby stroller violation had also come, looking nervous but determined. They'd brought their next-door neighbor, who turned out to be a paralegal with experience in property law. She'd reviewed their case and was convinced something wasn't right about the supposed association. Detective Johnson arrived at 7:15, dressed casually and carrying a folding chair like any other neighbor. She sat up near the back where she could observe everything without being obvious. Ada Williams had decided to wait in an unmarked car down the street until she was needed. Tom served as the unofficial host, thanking everyone for coming and explaining that they'd invited the Community Standards Board representatives to answer questions about association rules and procedures. "We figured it was time we all got on the same page about what's expected of us as residents," he said with a perfectly straight face. At 7:30 sharp, Linda and Rick arrived. They'd dressed formally, Linda in a navy blue suit that was clearly meant to convey authority, and Rick in a gray suit with a briefcase that looked suspiciously new. They surveyed the crowd with obvious surprise and some nervousness. "Wow, quite a turnout," Linda said, her fake smile making its first appearance of the evening. "We weren't expecting such a large group. People are really interested in understanding how the association works," Betty said sweetly. "We have lots of questions." Linda and Rick set up a small card table at the front of the gathering, spreading out their clipboards and official-looking papers. David noticed that Rick kept glancing toward the street as if calculating escape routes. "Well," Linda began, "thank you all for coming to this informal information session. The Pine Valley Community Standards Board works hard to maintain property values and ensure our neighborhood remains a desirable place to live." A hand shot up immediately. It was Jerry, a retired accountant who lived 3 streets over. "Could you start by showing us the legal documents that establish this association? I'd like to understand our voting rights and how board members are elected." Linda's smile flickered. "Those documents are quite lengthy and technical. We didn't bring copies tonight, but they're on file with our management company." "What's the name of the management company?" Jerry pressed. "I'd like to contact them directly." "Coastal Property Services," Rick answered quickly. "They handle all the administrative and legal matters." Another hand went up. This one belonged to the paralegal who'd come with the young couple. "I tried to contact Coastal Property Services to verify some information, but the phone number on the violation notices is disconnected. Do you have current contact information?" David watched Linda and Rick exchange nervous glances. They hadn't expected this level of organization or specific questions from knowledgeable residents. "There may have been some changes in their phone system," Linda said. "We can get you updated contact information after the meeting." Mrs. Chen raised her hand. "I paid a fine for my rose bushes, but I've been wondering who exactly received that money." "Can you show us the association's financial records?" "Financial information is confidential," Rick said, consulting his clipboard as if reading from official policy. "Only board members have access to those records." "But we're all members of the association," pointed out Tom. "Don't we have a right to see how our money is being spent?" The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. Residents wanted to see the association bylaws, the voting records for board elections, and documentation of the legal authority to impose fines. Linda and Rick had answers for none of them. "Look," Linda said, her composure starting to crack. "We didn't come here to be interrogated. We're volunteers trying to maintain community standards, and frankly, some of you seem more interested in causing trouble than cooperating." That's when David stood up. He'd been quiet until now, letting other residents ask the preliminary questions. "I think people are just trying to understand their rights and obligations. For instance, I went to the county courthouse and requested copies of all HOA documents for this neighborhood." He pulled out the papers Gloria had given him and held them up for everyone to see. "According to county records, no homeowners association has ever been established for Pine Valley. No covenants were filed, no association documents exist, and no legal entity called the Pine Valley Community Standards Board is registered anywhere." The backyard went completely silent. Linda's face turned pale and Rick actually took a step backward. "That's impossible." Linda said, but her voice had lost all its authority. The association was established when the neighborhood was developed. In 1987, David asked. Because I have the original development documents right here. No association, no deed restrictions, no community standards of any kind. More hands shot up around the crowd. People were putting pieces together and realizing they'd been scammed. If there's no real association, called out Mrs. Chen's daughter, then who did my mother pay $75 to? And who gave you the authority to fine anyone for anything? Added the young father with the stroller violation. Linda and Rick were clearly panicking now. Rick kept looking toward his car, while Linda shuffled through her papers as if searching for something that might save the situation. There seems to be some confusion about the paperwork, Linda said desperately. Maybe there was an error in the county filing system. No error, David said calmly. I've checked with 3 different databases and spoke with the head clerk who's worked there for 20 years. Pine Valley has never had a homeowners association of any kind. That's when Tom stood up and dropped the bombshell that David had asked him to save for the right moment. I've lived in this neighborhood since 1989, Tom announced, and I was actually on the original planning committee when these houses were built. We specifically chose not to have an HOA because residents wanted the freedom to maintain their properties as they saw fit. The crowd erupted in angry murmurs as people realized the full scope of what had been happening. Elderly residents on fixed incomes had paid money to people with no authority to collect it. Young families had gone into debt to pay fines for violations of rules that didn't exist. This is fraud, called out someone from the back of the crowd. They've been stealing money from people. Linda made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. Even if there was some confusion about the paperwork, we've been providing a valuable service to the community. Property values have increased since we began our oversight activities. Property values always increase, Jerry the accountant shot back. That has nothing to do with your fake fines and harassment. Rick finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Maybe we should reschedule this meeting until we can sort out the documentation issues. I don't think that will be necessary, David said. He turned toward the back of the crowd and made eye contact with Detective Johnson. I think we have all the information we need. Detective Johnson stood up and walked forward, pulling out her badge. Linda Walsh and Rick Patterson. I'm Detective Johnson with the Pine Valley Police Department. You're under arrest for fraud and theft by deception. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Detective Johnson read them their rights. Linda and Rick offered no resistance. They seemed too shocked to even speak. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Linda finally found her voice. Who are you? She demanded, staring at David. What gives you the right to investigate us? David smiled. Just a concerned neighbor who doesn't like seeing good people get taken advantage of. But Rick was staring at David with growing recognition. Wait a minute, he said slowly. I know you. Your picture was in the newspaper a few years ago. You're that FBI agent who broke up that big white-collar crime ring downtown. The crowd turned to look at David with new understanding. Betty started to laugh. No wonder you knew exactly what questions to ask. As Detective Johnson led Linda and Rick to her patrol car, David addressed the neighbors who'd been victims of the scam. Detective Johnson will need statements from everyone who paid money to these people. The district attorney's office will work on getting your money back as part of the prosecution. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. I can't believe I fell for it. I should have known better. Don't blame yourself, David said gently. They were very convincing, and they deliberately targeted people who trust authority and want to follow the rules. That's not a character flaw. That's what makes you good neighbors. As the police car drove away with Linda and Rick in the back seat, the crowd began to disperse. People were relieved but also amazed at how close they'd come to being permanently intimidated by a couple of scam artists. Tom walked over to David and shook his hand. I guess your retirement is going to be a little more exciting than you planned. David looked around at his neighbors, people who'd shown courage in coming forward and asking hard questions when they suspected something was wrong. You know what? I think I'm going to like it here. The next morning, David woke up to find his front yard full of neighbors. Word had spread overnight about the arrest, and people were stopping by to thank him and share their own stories about Linda and Rick's scam. Betty had brought coffee and homemade muffins, turning his driveway into an impromptu neighborhood celebration. I still can't believe it, said Mrs. Chen. shaking her head as she sipped coffee from a paper cup. All this time I thought I was breaking some important rule with my roses. I've been worried sick about getting in more trouble. Her daughter, who'd driven down for the meeting and stayed overnight, put an arm around her mother. The important thing is that you're getting your money back, and these people can't hurt anyone else. Detective Johnson arrived around 10 o'clock to update David on the investigation. She'd spent the morning interviewing Linda and Rick, and the results were even more shocking than anyone had expected. They confessed to everything, Johnson told the assembled crowd. Turns out they've been running this scam in 4 different neighborhoods over the past 8 months. We estimate they collected over $12,000 from victims across all locations. The numbers were staggering. Linda and Rick had been making more money from their fake HOA scheme than many people earned at legitimate jobs. They'd specifically researched neighborhoods with high numbers of elderly residents and young families, people who were most likely to pay rather than fight. How did they get started? Tom asked. According to Rick, it began when they moved here and genuinely thought some of the neighborhood maintenance standards were too low. Johnson explained. When their complaints to neighbors were ignored, Linda came up with the idea of creating fake authority to back up their demands. It started small. They just wanted people to paint their mailboxes and keep their lawns neater. But when the first person actually paid a fine instead of arguing, they realized they'd stumbled onto something profitable. David shook his head. Classic escalation pattern. They probably convinced themselves they were providing a service at first, but greed took over pretty quickly. Johnson nodded. By the end, they had a whole system worked out. Rick would scout neighborhoods during the day, taking photos and notes. Linda would create official-looking documents that night. They'd deliver notices in the morning and collect money within a week or two. What happens to them now? Asked Jerry, the retired accountant. They're both being charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. With victims in 4 neighborhoods and the amount of money involved, they're looking at serious prison time. Ada Williams arrived as Johnson was finishing her update. She'd spent the morning reviewing all the evidence and preparing charges that would ensure Linda and Rick faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. The good news is that we've frozen their bank accounts and recovered most of the stolen money, Williams announced. Everyone who paid these people should get their money back within the next few weeks. The relief on people's faces was obvious. For many of the victims, losing $50 or $100 had been a real financial hardship. Getting that money back would make a significant difference in their lives. There's something else you should know, Williams continued. This case is going to send a strong message to other scammers who might be tempted to try similar schemes. We're going to prosecute this aggressively and make sure it gets media coverage. As the crowd began to thin out, several neighbors approached David privately to thank him and ask questions about his background. Word was getting around that their quiet new neighbor had turned out to be much more than he appeared. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd paid $75 for her clothesline violation, grabbed David's hand with tears in her eyes. You saved us all. I was so scared of getting in legal trouble I would have kept paying them whatever they asked for. That's exactly what they were counting on, David replied. People like Linda and Rick prey on trust and fear. They find good people who want to follow rules and turn those qualities against them. Tom walked over as Mrs. Rodriguez left. So, he said with a grin, when were you planning to tell us you're some kind of famous crime-fighting retiree? David laughed. I wasn't trying to hide anything. I just wanted to settle into the neighborhood quietly. I've spent 30 years dealing with criminals and scammers. I was hoping retirement would be a little more peaceful. 30 years where? Betty asked, curiosity getting the better of her. FBI, David said simply. I specialized in white-collar crime, fraud investigations, things like that. When I saw what Linda and Rick were doing, I recognized the pattern immediately. Jerry whistled low. No wonder you knew exactly what questions to ask and how to build a case against them. The truth is, David said, you all did most of the work. You came forward with information. You organized yourselves, and you had the courage to stand up to people who were intimidating you. I just helped point you in the right direction. Detective Johnson approached with a final update before leaving. I wanted you to know that we've contacted police departments in 3 other cities, where Linda and Rick might have been operating. Your case is going to help shut down similar scams across the region. Any idea how many other victims there might be? David asked. Too early to tell, but based on their bank records and the materials we found in their apartment, This could involve dozens of neighborhoods and hundreds of victims. As Johnson left, David realized the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Linda and Rick weren't just neighborhood bullies. They were part of a growing trend of fraud targeting suburban communities. Their arrest would prevent countless other families from being victimized. Over the next few days, David's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters wanting to interview the retired FBI agent who solved the fake HOA case. He politely declined most requests, preferring to let the prosecutors handle media coverage. But he did agree to speak with a local consumer protection group that wanted to use his case as an educational tool. They were developing a presentation to help other neighborhoods recognize and respond to similar scams. The key thing to remember, David told the audience at their community center, is that legitimate authorities can always provide documentation. Real HOAs have bylaws, meeting minutes, financial records, and registered legal status. If someone claims to represent an association but can't produce paperwork, that's a red flag. "What should people do if they suspect a scam like this?" asked a woman in the audience. "Ask questions, demand documentation, and don't be afraid to verify claims independently. Contact your county clerk's office, check with neighbors, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." 2 weeks after the arrest, Pine Valley held another neighborhood meeting, this one purely social. They gathered in the same backyard where Linda and Rick had been exposed, but the mood was completely different. People brought food to share and spent the evening getting to know each other properly. David found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to hear stories from his FBI career. He shared a few safe anecdotes about cases he'd worked on, but mostly he enjoyed listening to other people's stories about their families, careers, and dreams for the neighborhood. "You know," said Betty, "I've lived here for 20 years, and this is the first time I've really felt like we were a community. Linda and Rick accidentally brought us all together." Tom raised his glass of lemonade in a toast. "To David, for showing us that sometimes the best neighbors are the ones who refuse to mind their own business." David laughed and raised his own glass. "To Pine Valley, where retirement is never boring." As the evening wound down and people began cleaning up, David reflected on how different his life had become in just a few weeks. He'd moved to Pine Valley seeking peace and quiet, but instead had found something much more valuable: a community of people who looked out for each other. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Johnson. Linda and Rick had been formally sentenced that afternoon. 2 years in prison for Linda, 18 months for Rick, plus full restitution to all victims and community service when they were released. David smiled as he put his phone away. Justice had been served. His neighbors were safe, and $12,000 was being returned to people who needed it. Not bad for a supposedly quiet retirement. Walking back to his house, David noticed that someone had replaced the black mailbox that had started this whole adventure. In its place was a bright purple one with a small sign that read, "Violation Free Zone." He chuckled and shook his head. After 30 years of fighting crime in the big city, he'd finally found his perfect neighborhood. It just happened to come with a few more surprises than he'd expected. As David turned off his porch light and headed inside, he could already see his neighbors setting up for tomorrow's impromptu block party. Retirement in Pine Valley was definitely going to be interesting.